And welcome to week 2 of Philosophy 307, Philosophy of Law. Allow me to share my screen and we will get started. Okay, so this week um, we're going to talk about natural law theory, which is one of the two main contenders for theories of law. Um, so the first question that philosophers will often ask is when discussing a topic, having a debate, or examining an issue, is what terms mean. So one of the things we first have to get clear is what a law is. And one of the ways you answer questions like that is you appeal to theories. So in philosophy of law, one of the main questions is what is law? Seems like a good question because it's the philosophy of that thing, law. So what is it? And it turns out there's two prominent theories of law as to what constitutes law, what counts as a law. And the oldest one is called natural law theory, as you might imagine, because there's a picture of Thomas Aquinas in the background with his iconic bowl cut. Uh, natural law theory is rooted in religious conceptions. So Thomas Aquinas is famously a Catholic, very much a believer in God, and one of the founders of natural law theory, at least in the Western tradition. We're not going to get into this because it's a sort of Western philosophy class, but you do find similar conceptions, not quite the same, but similar views of law in like Eastern philosophy and medieval philosophy, for example, and Middle Eastern and Islamic philosophy. But uh, that would that would make the topic even more difficult to deal with. So we're not going to get into all that. That's like graduate level stuff too. So natural law theory. So it's called the doctrine of natural law, and the title sort of gives it away. But there's something about nature, the universe, or creation, however you want to cash it out, that constrains what even counts as a law. So there's the existence of the possibility of no natural law, and a bi-definitional, dimensional or dualistic conception of law. Uh, so law can't be reduced to positive law or real law. And all that means simply is that there's the law in the books and there's the law of nature, morality, and God. So um, sort of like um, in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, uh, when the founders say that humans have been endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, as ironic as all that is, given what was going on at the time. What they're really saying in that passage is that there's a conception of justice and sort of natural law that precedes and is foundational to the laws passed by governments. So this is what Aquinas means by bi-dimensional or dualistic conception of law. There's the laws in the books, and then there are the laws of nature or the laws of God. Now, you don't have to necessarily cash this out in theistic terms. We'll get to that in a second. But it's really just the point to highlight right now is just that there is a distinction between laws on the books, laws as passed by legislatures, dictators, committees, pick your government type on the one hand, and a much more basic foundational law on the other. One way to think about this is when governments pass unjust laws and people protest, what they will often appeal to is things like theories of justice, morality, ethical considerations. Because a lot of people and a lot of philosophers think that legality and its legitimacy resides in right and wrong. To say that a law is legitimate is to say that it's right, it's just, it's fair, it is moral. To say that a law is illegitimate is to say it's unjust, it's unfair, it's immoral. So people already intuitively have this distinction between conventional law and a deeper sense of law. Um, but the natural law theorists go one further and say it's not just that morality, it's a kind of law. There's a diktat or a demand to it. So what makes it a natural law is that it precedes the laws passed by government. It's grounded in something much more robust, morally speaking, right, wrong, justice, etc. Um, and it's the sort of thing that legitimates or comes before the positive law. So we're going to get into each one of these components. I'm just giving you a sort of a quick overview of the theory. Okay, so Natural law is a law that humans do not produce. It's something we discover. You can think of natural law in this view of law, by the way. You can think of law as something like the laws of nature. The strength of gravity. Physicists have to go out and measure that. Physics has theories to help us think about that. How the curvature of space-time. These are things that are given to us by nature. We don't create them. It's not like we imagine the world and then go out and discover that the world is just what we imagined. That's not how that works. What we have to do is we have a conception of the world and we go out and we discover things and then we use those things to adjust how we see the world. If you think of sort of how science has evolved over the last few thousand years, that's how it's happened. It's starting out with these folk preconceptions, and then you move to something that doesn't match up as much with common sense, but is given to us by nature. Um, and nature is something that precedes and transcends mankind, humankind, long before, how long before they were even animals. They were laws of nature. They didn't kick in, or excuse me, they were natural laws. They didn't kick in or apply, but they were there. Just like there were laws of mathematics and laws of physics before there were ever even mammals or reptiles. Um, so it's nature, and it's because this nature, it's the natural law. It's untainted by our nonsense, by the picadillos of the politics of the day, the specific goings on of international relations, the tantrums and nonsense of a particular leader. I'm not pointing fingers, and I have people in mind, but I'm not going to name names. But my point is that stuff will change over time, but the laws of nature will not change. Well, it's a natural law. There are laws that we don't create and we don't control. Um, natural law doesn't deny the existence of positive law. So I don't want to misconstrue how natural law theorists, and there's a lot of them, by the way. There's a lot. This view is very diverse. I'm just giving you sort of the overview and the things that all the different varieties have in common. But natural law theorists do not deny the value or importance of passing laws in legislature or the government. Those things are very, very important. They're needed, and there's a reason for them. They just think they're not grounded merely in the opinions or attitudes of legislators, politicians, bureaucrats, and voters. That even those folks answer to something much more deep, much more fundamental. So it's denying that it's exclusively about, like when the Congress passes a law, what makes it a law is partly the fact that Congress passed it. But if it weren't based in natural law, then it ain't a law. Doesn't matter how many times Congress passes it. So what natural law theorists are not denying is the value of the legislature, or in our case, the Congress in the United States. Congress's value, well, less and less these days because it passes fewer and fewer laws, but it has value nonetheless, insofar as it passes laws that guide our actions. But those laws are only laws insofar as when the Congress passes them, they're also grounded in natural law. They're just, they're fair, etc. Um, so what really natural law theorists think is there's just a hierarchy of law, and insofar as positive law is law, so when Congress passes a law, what makes it a law is the fact that Congress passed it, but also that it's rooted in natural law too. How you figure out what is rooted in natural law and what isn't is a very, very difficult exercise, something that natural law theorists have been struggling up till today. Robert P. George, who is a natural law theorist, I think he's at Harvard. But in any case, my point is that there are still natural law theorists to this day, and there's a big debate about how you decide what a natural law is. So I'm bracketing that off for a second because students are naturally going to have that question. It's okay, fine. There's these fundamental laws that are underneath laws that legislatures pass. Okay, cool. What are those? Can you give me a list? Excellent question. A question I would have, but it's one that varies from natural law theorist to natural law theorist. But in any case, but it's important to get that like there's just levels to this thing. It's the first move they're going to make. So natural law theorists are just saying, look, our first move is to differentiate between natural law and positive law. Positive law is what comes out of a legislature or a Congress. That it's the piece of paper or the PDF with the information. It's got the signatures and the official state feel and what gets enforced. That's the positive law. But insofar as it's a law, it has to be connected to something much more fundamental, natural law. So natural law is unwritten. It's the sort of thing that sort of like mathematics is unwritten in physics or in physical systems. So momentum or that sort of thing. You can use mathematics to capture physical systems, but it's not really written. Natural law is really the point of it's where the legal rubber meets the moral road. So this is something that natural law theorists have intuitions that you really, in order to even be a law, it has to be just. There has to be something intrinsically valuable about that law. Like I can't just pass a law saying something like, oh, what? All people whose favorite color is green no longer have rights. It's just like you could pass it in a positive sense, in a positivist sense, meaning you could have a piece of paper with writing on it, it was passed by an authority. But natural authors would say that's not a law. It's a way to control people. It's a way to coordinate government actions to put people in jail or fine them or punish them for breaking laws. You can do that or breaking the rule. You can call it, I guess, a rule of some kind, but it doesn't constitute a law. So, as I said in the last lecture, imagine by analogy, you want to buy a car. Okay, so I offer to sell my car to you, and you say, cool. So I list off a bunch of features, and I think that's pretty good. And then I pull up with my tow truck and I bring the car. And you're like, what happened? Like, I thought I bought it's just this total piece of crap that I'm dragging behind this tow truck. But it has all the features if it weren't broken. Like it's the model, it's the make, it's the year, it's got the mileage, etc. It just happens that, in between then and now, it got in a car accident and got totaled. I take it you would think in some sense that's not a car. It resembles a car, has a lot of the same features a car had. It used to be a car. It was a car not that long ago. It has ceased to be a car. So that's sort of how natural law theorists look at the law. You can pass all the pieces of paper you want with writing on it. If it doesn't, the law doesn't intersect with morality, if it doesn't have the right features, and particularly if it's not just, then strictly speaking, it's not a law. Meaning you can't break an unjust law because it's not a law to break. So does it have intrinsic value? Are its obligations justified in some sort of objective, independent standard? Now you might think, ethics is so subjective. How could you have an independent standard? And it's something I get from a lot of ethics students, which, by the way, it's not true. Ethics is not very subjective. People think it is, but it's not. Just consider that the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, in some form or other, like not necessarily that wording. You find it in Christianity, but you find it in Judaism, and you find it in a lot of religious traditions, independently around the world. It's weird, this idea that you don't do something to someone that you would not like being done to you is almost universal law. Like in the sense that people stumble across it in different cultures and different times, different philosophies, different religions. They don't always state it the same way. It's not always cashed out exactly the same way, but the idea is similar. That what you do to others will be a measuring stick for what's done to you, and that is fair. It's some sense of fair. Now we could debate that whether or not it's true, and natural law theorists have. But my point is that there's this interesting thing where people will think ethics is subjective, and there's some subjectiveness to it, to be sure. It's difficult to adjudicate. That's definitely sure. It's like quantum mechanics, man. It's hard to figure out. But it doesn't follow from that that it's wholly subjective. And that's what a natural law theorist is going to say back. Like, there's just some things that are just objectively wrong, objectively unjust. They're the sorts of things you wouldn't like being done to you because you don't think they're fair or just. And so when people do that to each other, what they have to do is come up with excuses or justifications because they damn well know if they don't have excuses or justifications, what they're doing is unjust. Locking somebody up, for example, there better could be a damn good reason that you're taking someone's freedom away. Because most people wouldn't like their freedom being taken away for just some arbitrary reason, right? So that's just an example. There's lots of ways of going about this and explaining how there's objective sides to morality and you can bring them out with arguments and stuff, but just kind of a little taste. But this is what natural law theorists think the law really has to be grounded in morality and ethics in order to be law. Um, and so really, I mean, to go back to the question that students will naturally have, which is, okay, fine, there's this layer, it's called natural law, and it's below positive law. It's below the pieces of paper and signed legislation that legislatures and the Senate and various legal and deliberative bodies will pass. There's that law, there's the positive law, and then there's something deeper, the natural law, that's grounded in, according to these folks. But the question will be, okay, so how do you find that out? It's discovered by reason and choosing between good and evil. Well, it's not easy. That's the difficulty. This is one of the problems with the natural law view. If you want to know what the law says in the positivist view, which is the view we're going to examine next week, you just go look. just go check the legislation that was passed and see what's being enforced by the government, the state, whatever. If you're in France and you want to see what the food laws are, you presumably look them up. And if you can speak and read French, then you have a pretty good idea of what they are. I mean, maybe you need to hire a lawyer or something, but it's in principle can be done, and it can be done in a way that's pretty objective. Um, Things like murder, theft, property rights, lawsuits. There's all kinds of ways in which the law, as written on paper, is very, very clear. Now, there's cases where it's not, but compared to natural law, it's much clearer. So one of the things that critics will say about natural law theory is that it's so hard to pin down, it's basically useless. So even if it's true, there may be a natural law. I mean, for all I know, hell, for all I know, maybe there is, they'll say. The problem with that argument, though, is that that doesn't really help us adjudicate disputes in the law and figure out what counts as a law and what doesn't. If it's hard to pin down what natural law is, and saying natural law is discovered by humans through the use of reasoning and choosing between good and evil, sort of the example I gave with um, the golden rule. You could say that, that's fine and dandy, but it doesn't really adjudicate hard cases in a sort of in a very applied and practical way. So if we're in actual court or we're arguing about a piece of legislation and we're trying to figure out the right course of action, and there's several different options, policy choices, etc., simply alluding to this abstract and vague natural law doesn't really help that much. That's what critics would say. So, but natural law theorists would say, well, yeah, it's difficult, but when you can do it, it's worth it. Just like things in science can be difficult. Personal growth can be difficult. Um, Reforming political institutions can be difficult. A lot of things are difficult. In fact, many things worth doing are difficult. So the law theorist would respond, yes, it may be difficult to, or not very convenient to think in terms of natural law when we're talking about details, but that doesn't make it false, and that doesn't make it lack of value. That doesn't divorce their value. Um, so there's different. Back it up. Sorry. There's different theories of natural law. So one question you might ask is like, how do we discover natural law? We're going to bracket that off because it's a very, very difficult question. And like I said, there's a lot of topics in philosophy of law we could cover. We don't have the time. If this were a graduate course and we had twice or three times the time, we could really get into the minutiae of these topics. But like I said, so bracket off or just ignore for a second the idea that we can't figure out which, like the natural law. Okay, so I think that's potentially an objection, but to a point, and it's a bit of a distraction. So really the purpose here is just to understand the gist of what the natural law theorist is saying. But you might have another question, which is, okay, what makes it the case that these natural laws? Like what explains it? As philosophers say, what grounds it? So there's biological and naturalistic theories. It just so happens on this view. So what I'm saying is that not some natural law theorists are religious and some aren't. They typically are, but there's some natural law theorists that are not religious. In fact, there's some that are even atheist. So one of them is based on a biological natural view. Natural law it's an impersonal biological law, and it governs nature eminently. So you find this view among certain Eastern traditions. You might even think that like the Force in Star Wars is something analogous to this. Plato's Form of the Good in the Republic, when he's talking to Socrates and others, or when Socrates is talking to other people, he's trying to lay out a theory of justice. He appeals to the form of the good, which is like this transcendent good. It's rises above the material. It seems so. This is a view you could potentially hold. There's something about nature. There's some fact of nature that makes certain things just or unjust, even devoid of any kind of overarching mind or agenda. Sort of like if you're in like a Judeo-Christian Islamic sort of that tradition, Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. So you can hold that view. Presumably, some people in different religions have and traditions and cultures. And you might think Yoda from Star Wars holds this view. So, if only indirect. Then you have the much more common theological theories. So, the natural law is grounded in the goodness and commands of a good and powerful God. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Judeo-Christian God. It could be any God that is good and powerful. and somehow has the ability to set what we ought to do. So this is somewhat related to a topic that we're not going to really get into here, but if you were to take a morality or ethics class, you might talk about divine command theory, the theory that God's commands are what make things good or bad. So you might think natural law is just rooted in the nature and commands of God. And then finally, the more popular one these days, if you're going to go the secular route, if you're not particularly religious, but you like the idea that there's natural law, is the rationalistic theory. This is the idea that what makes it natural law is that it's the only way to get along. It's because we've discovered it through a reason, and these are the sorts natural law are the sorts of laws that, if enacted, will allow societies to prosper. So it's a way of functionally defining a law. So think about it like this. If I were to ask you, what is a vending machine? Okay. And you were to describe it visually, it's got colors and buttons and it lights up and put your card in it and something, you know. If you were to describe it visually, you would only get some vending machines because vending machines look a lot different. There's a lot of variation. But there's one thing that all vending machines have in common. Their function. You put money in and you get something out, typically by pushing buttons. And it's a machine that vends products based on currency. So it's a vending machine. Now, it's a very vague and generic description, but it nevertheless captures the generality of what we mean by vending machines. And rationalistic theories of natural law sort of think the same thing. They say we're going to define natural law functionally as to what function it performs in society. So natural laws are those laws that, when enacted, guarantee a social life and facilitate um, social life, societies. So deciding who gets resources, deciding who marries who, deciding who gets educated. Basically, laws that ensure a society will flourish. So the rationalist the rationalist theorist of natural law, these are people who have a pretty good answer to, or a much better answer to the question of how do we know what the natural laws are compared to, say, the biological or the theological based theories. Because rationalistic approaches can just say, look, natural law is just whatever it is that allows society to flourish. Now, granted, we can have some arguments about, we can have some debates about what constitutes flourishing, but there's some things that clearly count as flourishing. A society that goes extinct isn't flourishing. A society where people are starving to death isn't flourishing. A society constantly at war with itself is not flourishing. And I mean, like, actually at war with, like a civil war, is not flourishing. A society intent on killing off its children so that it doesn't have future generations. How do you have society without certain things? Food, resources, shelter, some form or other, the ability to care for offspring and young so that the next generation can be born and society continues. There are a number of things that pretty clearly are needed to guarantee social life in a society. And natural law theorists who are rationalistic in nature just think, hey, look, we figure out the natural laws by deciding what laws work and what doesn't. The problem here, though, is that a positivist about the law, like the what we're going to talk about next week, the theory, can just come along and say, okay, cool. You can call this a rationalistic theory of natural law if you want. I mean, it's a free country, but it seems a lot like our view, the positivist view of law, actually. It's pretty much what you're saying is what we're saying. You're just slapping on what's no, it's a natural law theory. It pretty much just looks like you're saying what we're saying. Pretty similar. But there's a sliver of difference between the two of them. But in any case, this should give you some idea of where the natural law theorist is coming from. You don't have to master the ins and outs and all the details. I'm really just going for the gist. And once you get the gist of it, or the core, really what makes it natural law theory, um, that's important because that will allow us then to contrast it with positivist theories of law, which we are going to do next week.